von Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of a series of video programs on postgraduate research, supervision and training. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate supervision for women held at the Twin Waters Resort on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland in April 1992. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
Postgraduate training and supervision are relatively new areas in research and development in higher education, and it is important for us to be aware of the major pitfalls in order to avoid them or to help students overcome them. You got this book, Starting Research, Supervision and Training, fresh from the press. My aim was to provide you with background material on the topic of this conference, namely on how we can develop systems, policies and supervisors in higher education to help students develop researching and writing skills so that they become self-directed and effective learners and researchers. I had invited the authors, who are widely known for their research and development in postgraduate education, to write on the topic of their special interest within the given framework. And this is the result. In recent years, pressure has increasingly been exerted on higher education institutions in Australia and Britain by government and other funding bodies to improve the quality and effectiveness of postgraduate research to reduce dropout and late submission rates. I've summarized the main problems identified in the literature on postgraduate education in the introduction to this book. For the purpose of this conference, the following areas of concern are important: inadequate supervision, emotional and psychological problems, students' intellectual and social isolation, insecurity as to standards, lack of confidence in their ability to complete their thesis within the specified time limit or at all, lack of understanding and communication between supervisor and student, students' lack of knowledge, skills, training or experience in research methods, and consequently, late completion and high dropout rates. The common causes for delay in thesis submission have been identified by the British Science and Engineering Research Council. First, a slow start, especially problem formulation, literature survey. Second, students' perfectionism. Third, distraction from the main line of inquiry. And fourth, inadequate collection of the data due to poor planning. Various strategies have been suggested to overcome these problems by improving the single supervisor model and students' research skills. For example, the little booklet you have from CERC is a useful guide on supervising postgraduate students. Similarly, the Economic and Social Science Research Council, ESRC, has produced guidelines on postgraduate training in the social sciences, and I find Ingrid Moses' green guide very useful. There are also useful resources for students, such as the reference books by Medson, Howard and Sharp, Ballard and Clenchy, Phillips and Pugh, and Powles and others. My associates and I have argued in chapters 8, 11, 12 and 13 that most of the problems have arisen from the single supervisor model and that this model has to be supplemented by alternative models of group supervisory practice, such as the workshop model, the coursework model, the methodology group model, the directed team model, and the conference model. The workshop model first. Such workshops usually cover the following topics: communicating and interpreting rules and regulations, especially departmental rules and regulations, but also university-wide rules, discussing thesis standards, staff students' expectations, the role and function of a supervisor, problem definition, thesis design and rationale, writing the first draft and overcoming barriers to thesis writing, and the nuts and bolts of thesis writing, for example, the use of the library, including literature search by CD-ROM, the use of sources, analysis of contradicting sources, structure and timetabling of the thesis, note-taking, referencing, style sheets, and so on, and writing and presenting the final draft. The coursework model. In the social sciences, it's also important to offer seminars and tutorials on problems and methods in research to discuss the various research paradigms and philosophical problems, such as the problem of knowledge production, causation, objectivity, and values. Here you see an example of course, Problems and Methods in Research, all features of which are directly related to each student's research project. And this has the following advantages. Several supervisors contribute to the course and create a more open and cooperative environment of learning and researching. The second one, in general, students learn the foundations of academic research in theory and practice through group discussions with fellow students and several members of staff. In particular, students are assisted in the crucial problem areas in the research process through mutual support and interaction. That is, in defining their research problem, writing their proposal, design and rationale, and writing the first draft. That is, making the transition from analysis to synthesis and committing their ideas to paper. And the last point, the course provides a support system boosting student morale and self-confidence, lowering attrition and late completion rates. The other three models also involve candidates in the process of providing guidance to each other and sharing access to faculty and other resources in a group setting. The methodology group model is characterized by the participants' mutual interest in a particular methodology, although coming from different fields and sectors. For example, in 1990, a group of postgraduate students and supervisors from various universities in Queensland and managers from industry and government met once a month on a voluntary basis to discuss problems and methods in action research and their particular action research projects. The directed team model is based on the natural science model of team research in the area of the supervisor's expertise. In the social sciences too, a group of postgraduates may select related research topics and form a team that meets regularly with and without the supervisor to discuss problems and methods in research in the discipline. The conference model, as the name suggests, is based on the idea that candidates and supervisors meet at certain intervals, for instance, as we do today, or once a year, to discuss issues and major concerns at a national level, such as women research, overseas students, funding, and so on. In Chapter 8, we conclude that these trials of alternative supervisory groups were successful and have implications for the improvement of postgraduate supervision in other settings. What are the principles of good supervisory practice? In order to minimize problems of attrition and completion rates, universities have to improve postgraduate education. The following selected principles of good supervisory practice have been drawn from the literature and from the above models. First, the traditional single supervisor model can be improved by the following procedures outlined by Cirque, and you have the booklet, on page 18. Briefly summarized here is publication of a departmental document on good supervisory practice, carefully matching supervisor and prospective student, students being provided with a reading guide prior to commencement of research, The student's first year report to be assessed by academics other than the immediate supervisor. Regular meetings between student and supervisor. The student's record keeping to be checked to ensure it is systematic. A mock viva to be held 6 to 12 months before submission of the thesis. Second, the single supervisor model should be supplemented by various group supervisory models, such as those which I've mentioned, with the following aims. To provide a supportive environment for learning and research through group discussion, group sharing of ideas, problem solving, mutual encouragement and motivation, overcoming the intellectual and social isolation of the lonely researcher. To identify and meet students' informational, motivational and social needs at the beginning and during their degree programs in workshops with fellow students and supervisors apart from their own, so that they are exposed to a wide range of perspectives. To save resources and time for supervisors who can cover topics and discuss problems with a group of students at a time, instead of repeating the process with each individual. This also has advantages for students. For example, topics are covered systematically rather than accidentally or not at all. To share resources and expertise among supervisors. This means that supervisors can specialize in certain aspects of postgraduate supervision and skills training, but not all, and that everything can be covered by the best academics. To make students be more responsible for their own and each other's learning. Postgraduates are able to provide each other with advice, help, and critique. For example, they can exchange literature surveys and copies of relevant articles and books. They can also critique each other's research proposals, draft chapters, and thesis. Once a climate of trust, open communication, and cooperation has been established. To ensure that the key areas of postgraduate supervision, for example, standards, expectations, requirements, roles, functions, are discussed, clarified, and agreed upon. To raise students' awareness of alternative approaches, epistemologies, and research methods through discussion rather than the method of lecturing. And to focus and reflect on the process of learning and researching rather than merely the content. This is achieved more easily and more effectively in a group than in a one-to-one relationship. I've incorporated these ideas, conclusions, and principles of good supervisory practice in the design of this residential program for women on postgraduate supervision. And the topics of the workshops cover the major problem areas and will model the process of these workshops, which you might adopt or adapt for your purposes in your department. The first workshop should always identify student needs and problem areas, which can then be dealt with in a series of workshops. I have found the Nominal Group Technique to be one of the most effective methods of needs analysis and also of getting feedback on subjects, courses, or programs. For those of you who have not used this technique in course evaluation or needs analysis, let me briefly explain the procedure. I've also prepared a handout with a description of the Nominal Group Technique, which you may follow in your small groups. First, you need a focal question or two. For example, this is one. What do you consider the main positive features, negative aspects of your postgraduate studies? And you can already see that that can be a needs analysis as well as an evaluation. First up is brainstorming. Silent generation of ideas in response to the focal question or questions. Everybody should clarify in their own mind what their individual personal response to the question is, and you give them 5 minutes. The next is then round-robin collection of ideas. Ideally, you have a group of 12, and we'll try that out after lunch in groups of 12, And once everybody has some items down, the scriber then asks each one to come up with a brief statement, very brief, or keyword, and you write that down and you make a list of 1 to 20 or how many items, and you go around the 12 and a second time and a third time until you run out of ideas. You don't write down ideas which are already up. You only add to them. Then once you have all the items down, step 2 is without discussion. You just list the items. And there are no right or wrong answers. And then you clarify what people meant, and you ask questions, and you have a discussion. And that is a valuable part. And in the very end, you assign rankings to the items to indicate the relative importance. For example, you ask the participants to select, say, the 3 most important items for them, and then to write these down on cards or these yellow slips. I have one there as an example. Can you show one on the next transparency? You all know the yellow pad. So they just write down the item and the item number on 3 different pieces of paper, and then you ask them to rank these 3 again in as a priority. Number 1 is most important, more important than 2. 2 is more important than 3. So that you have these 3. You then ask them to give you these 3 pieces, and you stick them up in rows, priority 1, priority 2, priority 3. That has the advantage that the whole group has instant feedback of the results. And for you, it is also easy then to provide a table and a brief report for the students. I think the students have then a right in the end to see the results of this session, especially if you ask them to evaluate a course. Could we just show an example of the ranking card? So you have the keyword of the item, timetable clashes, could be anything, and the item number, and you ask then the ranking, which is 1, 2, or 3, to be circled so that it doesn't coincide or confuse with the item number. Another advantage is also, thank you, that it is a constructive way of coming to a group discussion, group consensus. My suggestion for our focal question today is, for you personally, what are the major issues and concerns in postgraduate training and supervision in your department?
We were discussing what the issues were, and we had a look at, in terms of whether or not we were going to combine some of the categories, but we decided to go ahead and do the voting as the categories came out from our round-robin discussions. And the way that we did the voting was we ended up with 2 sheets from the round-robin discussions. Each person had 3 yellow slips and numbered their 1, 2, 3 priorities, and then came up and stuck them on the piece of paper. We then counted them, putting a weighting of 3 if it was a first priority, 2 if it was a second priority, and 1 if it was the third priority. From that, we came up with a list of 10 or 11 in our case, because we were 16 in the group, so there was a few more perhaps important topics that came out. So we had 11 altogether. Teaching others how to think was the most important, I guess. That was along the lines of educating rather than training the student, so that they would come out with the concept of how to go about creating their own research and topic and so on, rather than just following a set model of any sort. So teaching them how to think. Then the lack of supervisory skills, academic disagreement and inconsistency. which led to misleading information to the student on what were the expectations and so on. They were the top 3 priorities. And then learning writing and communication skills. We felt there was a lack of students being able to, I guess, write and communicate their topics. And difficulty with appropriate research design, being able to articulate that design. Isolation distance, which applied to both the supervisor and the student. That is, the supervisor may have been in an academic isolation where they weren't with a group of people of the same research interest, and students in the same situation.
New fields, old structures. It's a good phrase that encapsulates a whole lot of the problems. We've got new fields emerging in the university. We've got these old structures that were built on the arts and science degrees, and they don't fit. We also talked about quality control, standards, feedback. In that, one of the things that came up is the need for supervisors to have some form of evaluation, if only to feed back into their own supervisory practice. We've got used to the idea that teachers, that one evaluates one's teaching practice, or some of us do, and we need to have mechanisms that assist supervisors to evaluate their own supervisory practices.
I think one of the most important things is the need for training of supervisors. And that's why we've got that number 1. And secondly, the need to clarify departmental practice and policy so we can actually back up our supervisors. Supervisors failing to communicate expectations. I think supervisors quite often fail to lay down the ground rules with their students when they start, and that's certainly one thing we thought was really important. And that moves on then to train students in research skills, and we thought that supervisors failing to take supervision seriously, and that leading on to teaching not being valued. Although the university carries on about teaching, basically we all tend not to trust the system and realise that teaching probably, while I say it's important, we really wonder whether it actually is. And I think that distrust has to be got over before supervision can be taken seriously.
The major issues and concerns that have been identified by the Nominal Group Technique are discussed in special interest groups.
The university policy should be advertised and followed, and the department should then write a policy reflecting university policy and make this available to staff and to students and supervisors. This policy might include, for example, gender issues, a contract system, a report system for supervisors, for staff projects, student projects, and perhaps postgraduate studies could set up some sort of styles, published styles for setting up this departmental policy as a guideline. A copy of the departmental policy should go to postgraduate studies so that they know that that's being formulated. Within the department, postgraduate committee made up of staff, students and maybe a representative from postgraduate studies should be implemented, as is suggested by university policy but quite often not carried out. The problems should be taken to the head of department, and if the head of department fails to act, then the problems should be taken to postgraduate studies. And as a last point, we thought that perhaps postgraduate studies should be resourced better so that they can then help with implementing any of the problems that have been brought up with the committee.
If we could actually identify what the skills of supervision were, as opposed to what the skills of, the discipline skills or the research skills, but the actual skills of supervision, which we think are pretty close to the skills of interpersonal relating, probably. But skills in helping students to focus, in time management, in guiding and not controlling, mentoring students into the ethos of an academic environment, and the interpersonal skills that are needed to be an effective supervisor were some examples of the skills that might be useful. Once the skills are identified, then you could have specific workshops to work on those skill developments, and we wouldn't take it as an assumption that just because one has done a PhD, that makes one a good PhD supervisor. We talked about support. It would be good to have a skills register within the university, within the state, within the country, so we know how to link into people with similar areas of expertise or areas of expertise that we want to link into. We talked about seminars and workshops for supervisors within the department, school or faculty as a way of having as an ongoing support system within the institution, so that we could get together and share our experiences and draw on the experiences of others.
We thought that it might be possible for universities to make space in their allocation of postgraduate scholarships for new fields of study and for new approaches, and the universities need to be prepared to risk a bit of their resources and so forth in supporting some exciting ventures that may well reap them rewards in the long run. I did mention that a couple of universities had actually designated nursing as a priority area for the awarding of postgraduate scholarships, and there is promise, I think, in that sort of approach, not that you can get everyone to do it, but that we should start getting some areas that are not really getting their share, because what has happened in a lot of fields, and this was what came out in the conversation, was that the people whose areas of knowledge have not had the traditional structure of an undergraduate degree, honours degree, a PhD, are being disadvantaged in the competition for funding, even though they may well be people who would turn out superb pieces of graduate research.
The supervisor should, he or she, be a good scientist themselves. You couldn't have a bad scientist being a good supervisor, because they really wouldn't know how to go about tackling a problem if they weren't themselves a good scientist. Secondly, we decided that the supervisor should have a nurturing personality. There's nothing wrong with nurturing and helping your student if they have personal problems. Thirdly, we decided that availability was an extremely important issue. You must be there to talk to your student. And the supervisor should have good communication skills. Fourthly, we decided that they should have breadth as well as depth, that you had a broad knowledge of the subject, not just a narrow knowledge.